Welcome to this Easy 11 Plus short lesson on how to explain contrasting ideas in written comprehension. As always, the worksheet for today's lesson is linked in the video description along with lots of other useful resources. If you find this video useful, please remember to like it and to subscribe to my channel. Let's get started. So here's the question. How does the author create a contrast between the mountaineers and the avalanche in lines 26 to 29? And this is a 5-mark question. Now, when you've got a question like this, I often think it's very useful to think about the expected structure of your answer before you start mixing in ideas from the text. We're talking about contrast. And when you explain contrast, you need not only to say that two things are different, but you need to explain how and why they are different. And the structure of your answer is going to need to involve, for each point, talking about the mountaineers and the avalanche in either order, and explaining how the contrast is created. It's a 5-mark question, so one contrast point is very unlikely to be enough, but 2 points, in each of which you talk about the mountaineers and the avalanche, giving evidence for each and explaining the contrast, should be plenty. With that in mind, let's have a look at the text and find our ideas. We need to look at lines 26 to 29, so let's start by bracketing those off so we know exactly which part of the text we're working with. And now let's read it. Our axes held, and, breathless, bruised and startled, we found ourselves clinging to the slope, while the avalanche, momentarily increasingly in volume, thundered down towards the snowfields below, where at length, heaped high against the mountainside, it came to rest. Now, it might be tempting to make very simple factual points. So the climbers stay higher up the mountain while the avalanche continues to the bottom, or the avalanche is made of snow while the people aren't. However, these aren't effects that the author creates. These are really just factual statements about what's going on. We need to look in more detail at the language that's being used here and how it influences our sense of what's going on. Let's start by looking for an overall sense of what the contrast is. So the mountaineers are helpless here, clinging on, whereas the avalanche is moving freely and heading down to where it, as it were, wants to go. So that's the big difference between helplessness and powerlessness and power and purpose and destination. Now we have that clearly in our minds, let's look at the detail. One of the most striking things about the avalanche here is the noise that it makes. It increases in volume, it thunders, whereas on the other hand, the climbers are breathless and startled. The avalanche is, as it were, vocal and full of noise, whereas the people are breathless and in a state where they would really struggle to say anything. So that in itself creates a very clear contrast. I also just spoke about how the climbers are shown to be really helpless here, and I think the phrase that really captures that is clinging to the slope, whereas the avalanche seems to choose where it wants to go. And for me, the phrase that best illustrates that is came to rest, because it stops itself in a very controlled, restful manner, which couldn't be more different from clinging on to something for dear life. Now that second point seems to me like the most straightforward and direct one, and the one that I can most easily write, so I think that would be a good place to start when it comes to putting together the answer. We need to create as clear a contrast as possible here. If we can get both sides of our idea into the same sentence, that will very clearly show a comparison between the avalanche and the climbers, as long as our sentence doesn't become overly long and complex. So now we've got a really clear contrast with evidence. The climbers cling to the slope, showing how helpless they are, whereas the avalanche moves freely until it comes to rest. However, this is a 5-mark question. I think I could explain in slightly more detail why the word rest is important here. Rest suggests a controlled, relaxed stop. Okay, so I think that's a very clear point, which is very likely to be worth 3 of our 5 marks. Now on to the other idea. Let's go back to the text. So our point here is that the mountaineers are exhausted and breathless in line 26, whereas the avalanche is full of energy and in fact increases in volume, and the word thundered shows how loud it is. So that's a really clear contrast for us to write about. And I think for this one, I'm going to show how you can very clearly explain a contrast while using more than one sentence to link the two sides of the idea. So my first sentence here just talks about the mountaineers or climbers. Now let's contrast that to the avalanche. And a really good contrasting phrase to show how our ideas are linked is "on the other hand." On the other hand, the avalanche actually increases in volume, showing how much energy it has. Now you may notice that I started this lesson focusing on the volume of the avalanche and contrasting that to the climber's breathlessness. But I've actually focused this much more on energy, because I think that's a clearer and more direct point without us getting sidetracked into guessing how much noise the climbers might or might not be able to make. In my opinion, it makes it a better point. One thing I really want to draw your attention to in this answer is the way that I use linking words to clearly show contrasts and the progression of my ideas. So if you look at the first sentence as the word "whereas" that flips us to the other side of what we're talking about. Notice how I begin my second point with the phrase "what's more." And I've put that there as a kind of marker to say I'm now moving on to a new point, although it isn't completely unrelated. Then there's "on the other hand," which within that point flips onto the other side of what I'm talking about. But it also performs the function of making clear that this final sentence is still part of the same point that I was making in the sentence before. I hope that's useful. These questions are always difficult, but if you have a really good system for working through them, they become a lot easier than they may look at first glance. If this lesson was helpful, please remember to like, subscribe, and click the bell button. Please take a moment to look through the links in the video description. You'll find some useful things, including some freebies. And I hope to see you next Tuesday at 6 o'clock for my next Easy 11 Plus live lesson. Goodbye.